Chapters 1 and 2 of The Long, Long Trail. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. Chapter 1. He was popularly nicknamed Morgue, and it may be understood that strangers were apt to spell the name Morgue. Yet his full name, as he signed it on the day of his wedding, and never again, before or after, was Morgan Algernon Valentine. Someone discovered that hidden and forbidden signature, and once addressed the rancher as Algy, and the result was a violent accident. Yet Morgan Valentine was a peaceful man. He was one of those who accomplish romantic results in an everyday manner. Banish his mountains from his horizon, and he would have been a wretched man, and yet when he thought about the mountains at all, it was only to remember the trails that netted them and the sweat of the hard climbs. His labor in life had been noble, and was apt to prove enduring. 30 years before, he and his brother John followed the Crane River, where it splits through the higher mountains and comes out upon the lower rolling hills on the farther side. It occurred to John Valentine, who was the dreamer of the family, that the slopes might not be too steep to preclude cultivation with the plough, and though the regions of the hill crests were a jagged soil, much broken by rocks, there might be enough grass to graze cattle on. 5 minutes later he was painting a picture of the house which might be built there, one for Morgan and one for John, on opposite sides of the Crane River. There they could live in eyeshot, each with a broad domain separated by the arrowy yellow waters of the Crane. There was ample room for both, 100,000 acres of hill and valley land. And still another 5 minutes found John Valentine already tired of his dream and ready to spur on. But Morgan would not stir. There he resolved to pitch his tent, and though John tried valiantly to dissuade him, the tent was pitched, and the two brothers remained. Forthwith the empire which John had seen, the younger brother proceeded to build. Who are the greater men, the empire seers or the empire makers? At any rate, the thing was done. Front to front, a couple of miles apart, and with the noisy river splitting the landscape in the middle, rose the two houses. The house of John Valentine was planned as a nobly proportioned structure, and though it had never progressed beyond the columns of the entrance and the first story of the original, it was nevertheless beautiful, even in the piece. On the other hand, practical Morgan Valentine built himself a plain shack and gradually extended it. Now it stumbled up the hills on either side, big enough to shelter a whole clan of Valentines and their supporters. From which it may be gathered that John Valentine lived his life as Byron wrote his poems. He leaped once, tiger-like, and if he failed in the first attempt, or grew weary of labor, he was off to fresh fields and pastures new. He was the sort of man of whom people can expect great things. He could have sat on a throne, he could have painted pictures, or written verse, or made shoes for his own horses, but in accomplishment he was continually falling short. But Morgan Valentine seemed to have reached above his height. People wondered at what he had done. Yet perhaps his neighbors overlooked this fact, that simplicity may be profound, and though few thoughts came to him, those he had worked deep into the roots of his being. For instance, there was only one human being whom he had ever truly loved, and that was his brother. And when John died, Morgan transferred a portion of that love to the orphan daughter of the dead man. But Morgan's own wife and children were merely incidents in his life. It is necessary to be so explicit about this Morgan Valentine, because in spite of his simplicity, this narrative could never have been written were it not that he did some astonishing things. Indeed, so unusual were some of the things that he did, that one is tempted to add fact to fact, so that there will be no misapprehension, no tendency to call him a dream figure. On this night he was exactly 51 years and 3 months old. He stood 5 feet 9 3/4 inches, and weighed 180 pounds. He had a grey head and a young, stern face. He was slow in speech and agile in movement, and at this particular moment he was smoking a stubby corncob pipe on the front porch of his house, with his heels cocked upon the top of the railing. His wife was in bed. The servants dared not make a sound in the house, even if they were awake. The songs and the laughter of the men in the bunkhouse had long since died out, but Morgan Valentine, who slept never more than 5 hours a night, was still wakeful at 12. But if his body waked, his mind slept indeed, and only his eye roved lazily through the valley. A broad moon, nearing the full, had rolled like a wheel up the side of Grizzly Peak, and it cast enough light for him to make out the details of his possessions. In the heart of each valley there was the black ploughed land in narrow strips, incredibly rich loam; and over the rest of the unfenced ground where the cattle ranged, the moon flashed here and there on a bit of outcropping quartz, or twinkled along a line of new-strung barbed wire. But far and wide, over the neighbouring hollows, all to his right, was his, over range after range of hills rocking away toward a dim horizon. And looking straight ahead, all was his, to the silver streak of the river. Indeed, this was little more than an imaginary boundary, for though the great district beyond belonged to his niece, it would be, by all prospects, many and many a year before Mary Valentine was married, and until such a time he was the executor, his will was law through all the rich region of that valley. No wonder that the bowl of the pipe tilted up as he set his teeth, and he was filled with a solid sense of possession. Into his quiet thought beat the swift tattoo of a horse coming across the valley road. It rounded the hill, and at once the hoof-beats rang loudly through the night with the speed of the fugitive, the speed of the pursuer, the speed of anger, perhaps. Now the horseman lurched into view, a black form, with a black shadow trailing beside it over the white road. Straight up to the front of Morgan Valentine's house, then out of the saddle with a leap, then heavy heels and ringing spurs on the high flight of steps. He caught sight of the figure of Morgan. "Morgan Valentine?" he called. Now midnight hushes voices and makes men walk lightly, but the ring in this question was uncontrolled, as if the fellow had a right to waken the entire house if he felt so inclined. "Gus Norman?" queried the rancher, rising. "That's me." He came along the porch more slowly now, with the slowness of one who deliberates and prepares words. But when he came close, the calmness of Morgan Valentine snapped his self-control, and he burst out, "Valentine, it's got to stop." "What's got to stop?" That girl." He turned his head as he spoke, mechanically, and looked across the shining strip of the Crane River toward the unfinished house of John Valentine, which stood on the crest of a hill, white under the moon, and with a solemn Doric beauty. "What girl?" persisted Valentine obtusely. "What girl? Mary Valentine, your niece, that's what." "Stop? How stop?" "Stop her from going about man-killing." "What?" "That's what it amounts to. It's murder, Valentine." The ugly word came out with an ugly oath behind it, and the change in Valentine was instant. "Seems to me," he observed in his unhurried manner, "that you're talking kind of foolish, Norman. Suppose I give you a minute to think that over, and then say it again." The other shifted his position a little, but he rushed on with his speech of accusation. "I don't need no minute, nor nothing like it. My boy is lying home bleeding. That's what I'm here talking to you now. What I got to say won't keep. He's shot down, and it's her that has it done." For a time the glance of Valentine traveled gravely up and down the form of the other. At length he said quietly, "I'd sort of hate to have mother wake up with news like this. Mind talking sort of soft?" "There's no use talking soft," said the other, but nevertheless he lowered his voice. The whole world is finding out things about Mary Valentine, my friend, and the whole world won't be talking in a soft voice about what it knows." "Ah?" murmured Valentine. Suddenly his tone changed, as though the idea had just filtered completely home in his brain. "Now, what the devil do you mean by that, Norman?" "I ain't here to argue with you. I'm here to point out facts. My boy is shot down. Your son Charlie is the one that done it. How do you explain it?" "By the fact that your boy Joe ain't as handy with his gun as my boy Charlie. That's a tolerably clear explanation, I figure." "Tolerable clear for some, maybe, but it ain't the fact. The hand that held the gun was Charlie's, but the mind that directed it was Mary Valentine's." "All these here remarks," declared Valentine, "is considerable compromising, which maybe I'll be asking for more talk later on. But now keep right on. Charlie shot Joe, but you say that Mary had a hand in it. Where's Mary now?" "She's taking care of Joe. Your boys, Charlie and Louis, is both there, too, up at my house." "She's taking care of Joe?" echoed Valentine. "Listen, Morg, while I go back a ways in this story. You remember that there was a dance last Saturday night at Dennisville?" "I don't." "Anyway, there was. Well, did Mary say anything to you the day after that dance about her and my boy Joe?" "She didn't." "Then, sir, she knows how to keep a lot to herself. But Joe had something to say to me on Sunday. He says, 'Dad, I'm the luckiest gent on the ranges. I'm going to marry Mary Valentine.' I was struck all of a heap by hearing that. But Joe tells me that they can't be no mistake. She's as good as promised to be his wife. He'd never knowed her much before the night at that dance, but he took a liking to her right off, and it seems she done the same by him. He smiled at her, she smiled right back. It kind of went to his head. He started talking to her real serious, and she seemed just a wee bit more serious than him. Well, she scarcely danced with anybody but him the rest of the night, and when he came home the next morning after the dance, he was like a drunk. Couldn't think, couldn't talk of nothing but how beautiful Mary Valentine was, and how quick he was going to marry her. Couldn't hardly wait to get started with an outfit of his own. I spoke to my wife about it. The old woman didn't say anything. She just grinned at me. Pretty soon she allows that it's all right, but maybe Joe had better make sure of the girl before he got out any wedding license. That sounded like funny talk to me, but I didn't pay no attention. Well, along comes the dance at Salt Springs schoolhouse to-night. My boy goes over. He don't see nothing nor speak to nobody until he sees Mary Valentine come in. Then he goes straight for her. Then something mighty queer happened. They was another man with her. His name was Henry Sitterly, Hank Sitterly's boy. And when Joe goes up to her and starts talking sort of foolish, the way a boy will when he's in love, she looks right through him. Acts the way she'd hardly ever met him before, and pretty soon she goes dancing off with young Sitterly, and Joe can see her talking to him, and knows that she's making a mock out of him, my son. Well, it gets into Joe's head and starts him seeing red, and it gets into his heart and starts his heart aching. He don't think it's really no ways possible. He waits till the dance is over. He tries to see her again, but she sees him coming and slips away into the crowd and laughs back at him. Then it comes into Joe's head that she's jilting him, and—" "Wait a minute," broke in Valentine. "Did she promise to marry him that other Saturday night?" "They's other ways of promisin' things than with words, friend Valentine. She sure promised Joe with her eyes, and her smiles, and her sighs. So when she gave him the go-by like that to-night, he might near went crazy. He goes out into the hall, where there was some of the other boys standing smoking, and there he busts out with something about Mary being a flirt. Quick as a wink, your boy Charlie takes him up, like a bulldog he was, Joe says. Besides, Joe was too mad and sad not to fight it out. First thing you know, guns is pulled." "Who pulled his gun first?" cut in Valentine, snapping his words. "Joe." Valentine sighed. "Joe pulled his first, and Charlie beat him to the draw. But here's the point. Your girl starts flirting with my boy. She gets him so he can't sleep for a week thinking about her, and then when she meets him again she don't know him, or lets on that she don't. Then my boy says something he shouldn't have said. There's a fight. He gets shot through the arm. Thank heaven it wasn't no worse, and I tell you that it was Mary that had him shot, and not Charlie Valentine. Because why? Because when Mary and Charlie drive my boy back home in their buckboard, and while they're fussin' over him, and after Joe has told me what happened, I go to my wife and tell her I think Joe was crazy the first time he seen Mary. He was crazy with love. Calf love. But she just grins at me. Why, she says, don't you know she's the worst flirt in the country? And that's why I'm here, Valentine. 2 inches more to one side, and that bullet would have gone through my boy's heart. And the murderer would have been your girl Mary. Valentine, I'm new to the country. I don't know your folks nor your ways, but I know that in the part of the country that I come from, a girl like that ain't allowed to run around loose. She's kept up close, and if her dad can't look after her the way she handles her eyes and her smiles, then her ma goes along to watch out for her, and if her ma can't do it, then she ain't allowed to go out where there's young men to be made fools of and their hearts broke. If it don't come to no other thing, I'm a tolerable reasonable man, Valentine, and that bullet wound don't amount to nothin'. 2 weeks, and it'll be all healed up, but what if it had struck 2 inches away? So I come here straight to you and say, something has got to be done. I leave it to you what. During the latter part of this talk, Morgan Valentine had abased his head and stared at the floor of the veranda, but now he raised his head, and even through the shadow the other could see the black frown on the forehead of the rich rancher. "You got a reason for your talk, Norman," he admitted. "Now step inside, and I'll tell you just how this matter stands. You ain't the first that's had cause to complain. I wish you could be the last. But come on inside, and we'll talk." Chapter 2. But Gus Norman shook his head. "In my part of the country," he said stubbornly, "we like to talk in the open air. Keeps us cool." "Not a half bad idea. But before we start talking serious, maybe you'll tell me just what you're aimin' to do." "I'm aimin' to keep out of bad trouble, Valentine. I don't like trouble. I'm a peaceable man. But I ain't the only Norman around here. There's a lot of us, and some of 'em take this shooting sort of to heart. They want blood for blood. My brother and my nephew are at my house, and they want action. But I talked to 'em and told 'em to keep quiet till I come back." The other considered his visitor gravely in the dim light. Short time though this clan of Normans had been in the mountains, they had established a name for bulldog ferocity in fighting. "Look over yonder," he said at length. "You see that house?" "Yep. What has that to do with it?" "A whole pile. That's the house my brother built. He started building it and stopped halfway. All through his life he was starting things and stopping halfway. Well, Norman, his girl Mary is the same way. She's always starting things and stopping when they're halfway done. When she was a youngster, she was a regular tomboy, doing everything that my kids did. When Charlie first got interested in guns, she started practicing too, and she got so she could beat Charlie with a light rifle or a light revolver. She's still almost as good as Lewis, but she got tired of fooling with guns in a couple of months. Same way with hosses. Long as a colt was a wild one, she'd go riding every day and fight it. But as soon as the hoss got tame, she was done with it. And it's the same way with men. She's interested in every strange man that she meets, shows 'em that she's interested, and thinks they're the finest in the world, until they begin to think she's in love with 'em. But after a while she gets tired of 'em. Now do you understand about her, Norman?" The other shook his head and growled, "Guns is one thing, and hosses is another. But my boy is something more'n either, and he's got to be treated human." "Do you aim to make me force Mary to marry him?" asked the other calmly. "I ain't forcin' my boy on no girl. Speakin' without no offense, Valentine, I wouldn't have your girl in my family, but I think you ought to keep her in hand. They's other young men in my family. Maybe another'll fall in love with that girl when she makes eyes at 'em, and then there may be another fight. And the next time it may be your boy that gets drilled. Luck is always changin', but if she was my girl, I'd use the whip, Valentine." For some reason Valentine smiled at this, but the darkness covered the expression. "They's another side to her," he said gently. "She's a true blue girl, Norman. No malice in her. Keeps to her friends. Plays square. Every way except where some strange young gent is concerned, and then she runs amuck with her eyes and her smiles, just as you say. What can I do? Whip? Why, she'd murder me and then kill herself out of shame and spite if I so much as touched her. Don't you suppose I've thought of this before? Haven't I got most of the people around here down on me because of the way Mary has treated the boys one time or another? Ain't she always making trouble for me? And ain't my boys in peril of their lives because she keeps making places where they got to fight for her sake and their own? Then send her away. Ah, man, blood has got a feeling for blood. Can I turn out my brother's daughter?" The other was silent for a moment, breathing hard. He was a wild-looking man, with unshaven face, and a beard that began at his eyes and ran ragged until it terminated in a shaggy point beneath his chin. He was a lean, hard man, and he had reddish eyes as bright as the eyes of a ferret, and as restless. "The day'll come when you'll have sorrow in your home for keeping this girl here," he announced gloomily. "The day'll come when you'll wish you'd sent her off." "She's been away to school, man, but nothing changed her." "Sometime, Valentine, she'll find a man that'll be her master. Mark me when I say it. And when that man comes, she'll go to him and foller him whether he be good or bad. If she could find a hoss that would never be safe under the saddle, she'd never want to ride nothing but that hoss, I figure. And when she finds a man that won't pay no attention to her, she'll be following that man, Valentine, you mark my words. She'll love the man that laughs at her. She'll follow the man that runs from her. She'll kneel to the man that beats her." He paused again. For Morgan Valentine had shifted so that the moonlight struck abruptly across his face, painting the wrinkles and his frown black and making the rest deadly white. He stood with his jaw set, and through the shadow of his brows the eyes glittered. He spoke nothing, but Gus Norman saw enough to make him wince back a step. He put out his hand in a conciliatory gesture. "I don't wish her no unhappiness, and I don't speak out of no malice. I ain't come to talk hard, neither, nor to make no threats, but I'm here to put my case in front of you. You got a big reputation around these parts, Valentine, for being a square shooter. Put yourself in my boots and figure out what you'd do. My folks are a tolerable tempery lot, and they're a pile cut out about this fracas, but I'm holding 'em back. I don't want 'em to run foul of Charlie. Most of all, I don't want 'em to run foul of you. Think over what I've said. Good night." He turned on his heel, strode across the veranda, and went down the steps, and once more sent his horse up the road. Before he disappeared into the moon haze, Valentine was walking up and down the veranda with a short, quick step, and of all the people in the world, only his wife, no doubt, could have read the meaning behind his manner. Only his wife did know it, for the loud voice of Norman had wakened her in her room just over the veranda, and she had gone to her window. From it she had overheard the conversation, and now she knew the meaning of that pacing, that short, quick, decisive step. She gathered her dressing-gown about her, put her feet in slippers, and hurried downstairs. Her husband was coming in just as she reached the lowest range of the stairs, and she paused with her hand on the rail. It was a lovely hand, in spite of her 45 years, and the hard labor which had been hers during the early part of her married life. Her slippered foot, too, would have been the pride of a debutante, and the dressing-robe fluttered around her in graceful lines. She was still beautifully formed. Her skin retained its glow and purity of texture. But cover her hands with winter gloves, her feet with boots, her body with a heavy coat, and Maud Valentine became a homely farmer's wife. There had been a fine spirit in her face, but never beauty. And now that the grace and hope of youth was gone, there remained only the lines of the unloved wife and the unheeded mother of 2 wild sons and 1 headstrong daughter. "Are you up, Mother?" he asked from the hall beneath. "I couldn't sleep, Morgan." "Read a bit, then you'll sleep." "I wish to talk to you just a little minute, Morgan," she replied. Her voice had the gentleness of long sorrow. "Come into the library, then." They went into the big room ranged high with books, for John's library had been brought here after his death, and it was a rare collection. How few had been opened since his hand last touched them. "Are you warm, Mother?" She looked up at him quickly as she slipped into the big chair, a furtive glance. For one brief moment at the time of their marriage, whether it were a matter of days or weeks did not count, she had felt that he loved her truly, with a fire concealed by his customary self-restraint. And ever since those passionate days of happiness she had been probing him with these half-frightened glances in search of the vanished tenderness. And though she lived with him 100 years, there would still be a hope in her heart. But he was hardly glancing at her now as he asked the question, and settling back into the chair, she smiled at him, a still and quiet smile, for pain may take on the gentlest seeming. "Now, Mother, what is it?" "I guess maybe I shouldn't have said that I couldn't sleep. It was Gus Norman's voice that waked me up." "He talks like a roaring bull. Some of these days maybe a ring'll be put through Norman's nose, and he'll be led about." "I heard all he said." "Well?" At his carelessness she fired a trifle. "And heard that Charlie shot a man. His third man. He's starting well. Morgan Valentine, do you know what lies ahead of your son one of these days? Murder. I've seen him getting angry in the house and reach natural for his hip. And some day he'll get in trouble, and shoot, and kill." Her voice had raised very little, but her changing expression answered a similar purpose. Indeed, Morgan Valentine looked sharply at her, so astonished was he by any variation in her monotone. "He's sowing his wild oats, that's all. No cause for worry. He's never worried you, Morgan." There was a bitter emphasis on the pronoun. "None of your children have. Seems like you don't care sometimes." The remarkable fact that his wife was actually complaining finally reached the understanding of Valentine, and now he watched her calmly, waiting. His quiet made her flush. "Charlie, nor Liz, nor Louis. They none of them worry you, Morgan. You act as if Mary was your daughter, and my children didn't have your blood in 'em." "Mother!" murmured her husband. "I ain't going to make a scene, Morgan," she assured him, and she gathered her robe a little closer to her, as if to cover her trembling. "I'm just going to tell you a few facts. This ain't the first time that Mary's made trouble for me and mine. You don't like her, Mother. You got a bad light in your eyes every time you think of her. I've seen that for a long while." "I've done what's right for her," said Mrs. Valentine stubbornly. "They ain't nobody can say I haven't mothered her as much as the wild thing would let me, after her father died." Again he was silent, and again the silence spurred her on more than words. "And here she is paying me back. She's putting my boys in peril of their lives. That's what she's doing. And who but her has made my girl Liz unhappy? Why, Mother, Mary is always kind to Liz, always doing little things for her. Taught her to ride, taught her to shoot, taught her to dance even." "That's it. She's always led the way. Now Liz can't do anything out of her own mind. When she's in trouble, she don't come to her own mother, she goes to Mary. If she wants advice, she goes to Mary. And half the time, her and Mary has secrets that they're keeping from me. I come on 'em whispering together, and they break off as soon as I come. Mary makes a mock of me in my own house, with my own boys, my own girl." He had taken his pipe from between his teeth. He held it now in his stubby fingers until the wisp of smoke that curled out of the bowl dwindled. "Besides, what is they ahead for Liz? Who'll she ever have a chance to marry so long as Mary is around? Nobody looks at her except because they think it might make Mary smile at 'em. At parties they only dance with Liz, because maybe then Mary'll dance with them. They wouldn't ask Liz except to get Mary. And I can't stand it no longer. Ain't Liz pretty? Ain't she gentle and kind? Ain't she got winning ways? But as long as Mary is here, she'll have a second-hand life. That's what she'll have. I've watched and watched and watched, and my heart was breaking all the time. But I wouldn't talk until tonight. But now I see where things is leadin'. I see what Mary is doin'. She's bringin' into my house murder." Morgan Valentine stirred in his chair. "She's got the whole Norman clan worked up now. They'll all be layin' for Charlie. That's the kind they are. Hunt like wolves in a pack. And they'll pull down Charlie, and maybe Louis. And you'll stand by and see it all, and do nothin'." He expected her to break into tears at this point, but when her eyes remained dry, he moistened his lips and spoke. "What do you want me to do, Mother?" "Send her away." "Send Mary away? Mother, she's the last living thing that can remind me of John. I can't turn her out. She ain't fit to be sent away. She's got to have them near her that love her, Mother." "Men? She'll always have them." "Now you ain't playing fair and square. You know what I mean." "You don't have to send her away alone. Send her to her sister in Chicago. Lord knows she's asked to have Mary often enough. She'll let her study music or something." She left her chair and slipped to her knees before Morgan Valentine. "Don't do that, Mother. Get up, won't you?" "Don't you see what I want, Morgan? I want back all the things that Mary has stole from me. Charlie and Louis and Liz and you." "Get up, Mother. It ain't right you should kneel to me. But here's where I stay, because I'm begging you for my happiness and for my boys and my girl, Morgan. Will you answer me?" He looked down at her with a gray face, and she saw for the first time how deeply this cold man loved the girl. The pain of it made her cry out. "In all the time we've been married, it's the first thing I've asked you, Morgan." "Stand up," said Morgan Valentine. "I'll send Mary away." End of chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The law of compensation works in this manner. Those who give their hearts to few things give in those cases wholly and without reserve. The life of Morgan Valentine had been a smooth-flowing river until the death of his brother. That blow aged him 10 years. From that day until this, it seemed to him that his life had been a blank, and now another blow was to fall. For if the girl left him, she left him forever. The city would swallow her, the city and her new life. He might see her again once or twice, but after the parting he would be dead to her and she would be dead to him. He set his teeth over the pain and smiled into the face of his wife. He raised her gently to her feet, and she put her hands timidly imploring upon his shoulders. "Will you take it to heart a whole pile, Morgan?" "It's for the good of us all, Mother. I've seen that for some time. You see, I've been looking on Mary as a girl all these days, and here all at once she turns the corner on me, and I see she's a full-grown woman. It kind of beats me, but I guess she's got to go. This ain't no sort of a country for her. Back where men don't wear guns, and where they don't do more'n raise their eyebrows when they get real mad, that's the place for Mary to do her campaigning. But she'll be turning these parts around here into a regular battlefield if she stays." Mrs. Valentine caught her breath with joy. "I hoped you'd be reasonable like this, Morg," she murmured, "but then again I was afraid you'd get all gray in the face, maybe, the way you did when—" "Well?" "When John died." "Mary ain't dying." "Of course not, and it's for the best. It ain't the first time she started trouble, and you know it. There was the boys of old Jack White. They got into a fight because Mary smiled at Billy one week and at young Jack the next. Might have been a death if their father hadn't found 'em, it said. Then there was Bud Aiken, who— Hush, Mother, you're getting all excited. Besides, you ought to be asleep. Now you go back to bed and stop worrying." He stopped. The rattle of galloping horses had topped the hill and was rushing down toward the house. The cavalcade swept near. "Maybe more trouble!" cried the poor woman, clasping her hands. But as the riders poured past the house, a chorus of voices and laughter arose. "That's Charlie and Louis and Liz!" cried the mother, recognizing all 3 voices in the chorus. "And Mary," said Valentine. "Her, too," she added shortly, and sent a glance at her husband. The horses were put up, the voices grew out again, they were racing for the house. A shrill peal of laughter, a clatter on the steps, the door flew open and a girl sprang in. A flash of black hair and eyes, and the flushed face, and then laughter. "You tripped me, Mary." "But I got here first," she was crying in triumph as a burly youth crowded through the doorway, and behind him his brother and sister were coming. "Why, Mother, you up so late?" asked Charlie. and the wonder of this strange event made the four faces of the young people grow sober. "Now, mother," cautioned Morgan Valentine. "Charlie," she broke out, "what you been doin'? What you been doin'?" He went to her and tried to take her in his big arms, but she fended him off and held her head back to search his face. "Some hound has been here talkin'," he muttered. "It was no worse'n he said?" she queried. "You only shot him in the arm?" "It was only a scratch," said Charlie. "He won't know he was touched in a couple of days." "And, oh, Uncle Morgan!" cried Mary Valentine, taking his hands in one of hers and waving to big Charlie. "You'd have been proud if you'd seen him. I'm so proud of him. Joe Norman insulted me, and Charlie, oh, Charlie, you're a man." She turned full upon Charlie as she spoke, with such joy shining from her face that the boy crimsoned with happiness. "It wasn't nothin', Mary. Don't make me feel foolish," he stammered, and it was plain to be seen that he would venture 1,000 times more for her sake. And in the background was his brother Louis, with a shadow on his face, as if he too would have been gladly a part of this ceremony of rejoicing, and was determining to seize the first opportunity that came his way to strike a blow for the sake of Mary. But the voice of the mother cut in, cold and small, and withered all the happiness at the root. "Mary Valentine," she said, "it's you that's been drawing my boy into peril. It's you." "Aunt Maud!" cried the girl, and ran to her, but she stopped in the act of taking her hands. "Have I deserved it of you, Mary?" whispered the older woman. "Ain't I tried to be kind to you, and is this the way you pay me back, making murderers out of my sons?" "Mother!" cried Charlie, "I won't stand you talking like that. She didn't." "You see," said Mrs. Valentine sadly, turning to her husband. "Charlie, you shut your mouth and keep still," said Morgan Valentine sternly. "Ain't you got manners with your own mother? Liz, take your mother up to bed." The girl was taller than Mary by an inch or more, and strongly built, as blonde a beauty as Mary was dark. Yet when she went to her mother, she turned a glance of appeal upon her cousin, as though asking for direction. Mary slipped between her aunt and the door to which Elizabeth was leading her. "If ever you think hard of me, Aunt Maud," she said, "I want you to tell me what it's about. And if ever I've hurt you or done you wrong, I'll go down on my knees and beg you to forgive me. Tell me now, while your heart's hot with it." For a moment words trembled on the lips of Mrs. Valentine, but looking past Mary, she saw the face of her husband, bowed her head, and hurried from the room. "Go to bed," said Morgan to his two sons, and they trooped out in silence, casting back frightened glances, not at their father, but at Mary. She waved a smiling, careless good night to them, but the moment they were gone her bravado vanished. She ran to her uncle and caught one of his burly hands in both of hers. "What have I done?" she whispered. "Oh, what have I done?" "Speaking personal," he answered, "I'm hanged if I know. Sit down and we'll talk about it." They sat down. She was still holding his hand, and though he made a faint effort to draw it away, she kept it strongly in her own. Aunt Maud looked as though she hated me. "Stuff! But she looked straight into my eyes, and women have a way of understanding other women, Uncle Morgan. Ah, girl, there's the trouble. You're a woman now." "Do you mean that I've changed?" "I don't know how to put it, Mary." She cried out softly, "Do you think that I've changed?" "I knew your father before you." A little silence fell between them, in which both of them asked many questions and were answered. At length the rancher began speaking again, slowly. She waited. "If you was a man, Mary, you'd be a fine man, but you ain't a man. You're about 9/10 a woman, I guess, with just enough man in you for spice." "Is that a compliment?" "Instead of spice, I might say deviltry." "Oh." "I've got worse things than this to say to you. When you were a girl, Mary, I took all your mischief for granted. Yes, I have been very bad. Not bad, but you were always hunting for action, same's a boy does. You got into lots of scrapes, but you come out again just the way a boy does. But all at once you changed. You came pop out of a door one day, and you weren't a girl any more, you were a woman. That was when things started to pop. You see, nobody understands a woman." Except you, Uncle Morgan. Kindly leave me out. I don't know a thing about 'em. But you know everything about me. Not a thing, hardly. For instance, I don't know whether you just can't help making eyes at young gents, or whether you do it on purpose. Is that the cause of all the trouble?" She dropped his hand. "You see, it's the way I told you. I don't know a thing about you. Do you believe what people say? But tell me, aren't they right?" She gasped. "I thought so. You've turned into a man-eater, Mary. I think you're making fun of me." "Me? Never." "It's this way. I don't mean any harm, but when I see some boy I've never known very well, I just can't help beginning to wonder about him. What is he inside? Maybe he has a touch of the fire. I always keep hoping for that." "What fire?" I don't know." "Well, go on." "Maybe I met him at a dance. The music is in my head. He dances well. He doesn't talk much. My imagination begins to work on him. All at once he dawns on me. A new picture. He's strong, brave, gentle, clever, and has the spark of fire. I begin to burn with it. I'm happy." She dropped her chin upon her knuckles and stared gloomily into the distance. "And that's all I can say about it." "But mostly you tell him that he's making you happy." "Mostly." "And then what does the man do?" "Mostly he says that I've made him happy, too. Sometimes they start being foolish. They want to sit in the corner and hold my hand. I don't like that. Or if we walk out of the hall, they—" She shuddered. "Why do men want to put their arms around a girl when they're happy?" "What do you expect them to do?" "Why, talk, or be silent, and—" "Well?" "I don't know. But mostly they do something that makes me despise them before the evening's over. Or they don't, then I think about them until the next time we meet. And then everything pops into thin air. They always seem different. You understand?" "Maybe. It's just what I thought." "Am I bad, Uncle Morgan?" "No, but you need room, honey. I'm going to send you away to a big city." "You send—" "I won't go. It's Aunt Maud. She's never liked me." "Hush, girl." She saw suddenly that his hand was trembling, and the sight of his grief struck her cold with awe. "In some city," he went on slowly, "you'll see crowds of clean young fellas. Maybe you'll get over this, or maybe you'll find a man that's worthy of you. But there ain't any around here, and I know them all. Why, rather than have you marry one of these unshaven, thick-headed fellas, I'd shoot the man first. I want you to marry a gentleman." He spoke this last slowly, hunting for the words. She sat with her head bowed, and then she looked up to him. "You'll do what I want you to do, Mary?" She made a little gesture. He could not tell whether it meant yes or no, and all the while there was a glimmer in her eye like the changing colors of watered silk. Chapter 4. But 2 days later Morgan Valentine bought a ticket to Chicago and made his reservations. Mary had made up her mind, apparently, though not half a dozen words had been spoken on the subject of her departure since that first night. But the next day she was talking of Chicago as though all her life had been spent there, and this experience in the mountain desert was only an excursion off her beaten trails. "Between you and me, Uncle Morgan," she said, "why not New York?" This, for some reason, had rather staggered him, but now that the ticket was bought, dated ahead several days, and the step irremediably taken, he was easier. He made a short stay at Salt Springs that day. After he had the ticket in his wallet, he went to the bank and drew out the cash for his monthly payroll. His cowpunchers were numerous, as befitted the keeping of his big range, but, moreover, there were the hired men who worked the cultivatable ground, and in the northern part of his domain, the territory of his dead brother, there was a small logging outfit. Altogether he had some 30 men to pay off each month, and the payroll ran around $1,600. He got it all in gold coin, and it made a heavy little canvas sack, 15 pounds or so. It was 3 in the afternoon before his buckskins jogged out of Salt Springs on the back trail of the 25-mile trip, and though the going was fairly smooth most of the way, it would be dark before he arrived. That, however, was a small worry to him. The two geldings were sure-footed as goats, and, given their own sweet way and a shambling trot, they would take the buckboard home in rain or shine, through the night and the rocks. They had done it before, so now Morgan Valentine bunched his duster around his shoulders with a shrug, settled back into the right-hand corner of the big seat, and let the reins hang idly. An hour and 7 miles dropped behind him, and still the buckskins were jolting steadily on. The suddenness of their stopping jerked him through 1,000 miles of dreams back to the cold facts of earth. The buckskins had their heads high, and just before them was a horseman with a revolver pointing between the geldings and straight at the head of Valentine. He put up his hands with the utmost unconcern. "Thanks," said the stranger. "If you got any coin handy about you, you might throw it this way." There was deprecatory gentleness in this, the same tone of embarrassment which one uses when one asks a stranger for a match, and it made the rancher regard the hold-up artist with more attention. The man sat a down-headed roan, an ugly brute, which looked undersized in comparison with the bandit's length of limb, for he was a tall man with formidable shoulders. He had long arms also, which appeared extremely capable, and the heavy colt was poised lightly as a feather and firmly as a rock. He seemed indiscriminately somewhere between 30 and 40, and might have been at either end of this limit. What little hair appeared beneath his sombrero was sunburned and dusted to a pale gray-brown. He had one of those lean, long faces which are thin through the cheeks and wide through the cheekbones and the jaw. He was far from good-looking, and a very wide mouth and a highly arched nose, which showed that he clearly belonged in the predatory type of mankind, made up a further debit on the side of beauty. To complete the impression, his eyes were an uninteresting but very intelligent gray. In fact, one might say that the color of this man was gray. For the rest, he keenly impressed Morgan Valentine as being about equal portions of sinew and sinew-hard muscle. "I suppose," said Morgan, "that you want my gun first?" "I'm getting old, partner," admitted the other. "I'm forgetting my ABCs, but—" The last word was so explosive that Valentine paused with his hand on the way down to his weapon. "But," continued the stranger, "guns are things that I most generally like to take for myself. Thank you just the same." "As you please." He stood up and turned, his hands well above his shoulders, while the revolver was removed from his holster. "Which I'm acting like a fool amatoor," the bandit was saying apologetically, "and pretty soon you'll begin to be ashamed of being robbed." He skidded the weapon into the back part of the buckboard. "Now you can sit down again, partner." Valentine accepted the invitation. At close hand he found that the stranger lived fully up to his first impression. He was indeed a grim-faced fellow. Only his voice, which was of the most exquisite and tender softness, counteracted the general effect. "Now, if you'll give me your kind attention just a minute, sir," went on the tall man, "I want to explain that holding a gun is plain tiring to a gent of my nature that hates work, so I'm going to put it back in the leather. But here and there I've met curious gents that want to see just how quick that gun could come out of its house again and say how'd you do. But they've let me take a gun off their hip, and then they've sprung a surprise by fetching out some little token of affection from under a coat or a shirt, say a knife or a derringer. And them that have tried my gun have most generally found it right there on the job talking business." So saying, he slipped his weapon into its holster. "I think I follow your meaning," said Valentine, which I'm tolerable quick to do when men talk sense. He added, "Here's the coin," and he kicked the canvas sack so that it jingled at the touch. "I have some in my wallet, if that ain't enough to satisfy you." At this the stranger smiled gently upon him. "There's one part of my heart that's an achin' void, sure enough," he declared, "and that's the part where a plumb reasonable man fits in. Partner, you seem to be it. Nope, I don't want your wallet, I guess. That is," and here he lifted the canvas sack and weighed it in his hand, "that is, if this here talk is gold talk." Now, when he lifted the sack and held it lightly at arm's length, Valentine had seen a rippling of muscle under the shirt sleeves that fascinated him, so he murmured absently, "Yes, it's all gold." "Maybe it's the price of a few hosses you've just taken into town now?" went on the other thoughtfully. "Maybe it ain't," replied Valentine. "Yes, and maybe it ain't. Maybe it's the cash from some little claim you've been working for some time." "Maybe." "To cut it short," said the bandit a little sharply, "is this going to bust you or not?" $1,500 is quite a bit," observed Morgan Valentine. "Took me 3 years to make that much." "3 years' work in this bag?" "Yes." The gray eyes puckered and gathered, and a gleam went out of them, but Valentine withstood the stare. At this the outlaw stepped back and glanced over the equipage swiftly. "Judging by that harness and the way them hosses is set up, I reckon I can put that down safe as the granddaddy of all the lies I've heard lately." "You forget," said Valentine, "that I didn't say what 3 years they were. Recent ones are a long time back." The other grinned. There was something remarkably contagious in his smile. In spite of himself, Morgan Valentine found his face wrinkling. "I dunno why it is," declared the bandit, "but I take to you uncommon strong." "And I think I can begin to say the same about you, my friend." "Dear me," said the outlaw, and the feminine expression did not seem at all out of place for some reason. "We're getting real friendly, ain't we?" "Seems that way. You're the first hold-up gent that's ever troubled to ask whether or not what he took would bust me." "Judgin' by that, maybe I could say that stickin' you up is one of the favorite sports around these parts?" "Maybe you could. It used to be." "How many times have you been entertained?" "8 times," said the rancher. "Dear, dear! Who'd have thought you was that rich?" "The other 8," said the rancher, "lived in these parts and knew the size of my bank account." "8 times you left your roll behind you?" "2 of them," replied Valentine with a glittering eye, "I shot and buried. 2 more I carried back to town after I'd bandaged them. 2 more were killed by the posses, and the other 2 gave up before they were salted away." "You don't tell me!" exclaimed the other, with all the happiness of one who hears the ending of a pleasant tale. "And maybe this little job will give me more fun than I was looking for." The rancher examined him for a time. "No," he said, "I guess the 9th man will be the lucky one." "How comes that guess?" "As I said, the others lived in these parts, but you've come a long way, and you'll probably go on a long way still." "You talk better'n a riddle," declared the bandit, with open admiration. "How do you know I've come a long ways?" "By the way your hoss is gaunted up, by the knot in your handkerchief, and by the look of your eyes." "Eyes? As if you'd been riding into the sun for a good many days." "Them are all good signs. But I never heard of that last one before now." "Besides," said the rancher, "you've got a professional air. I wouldn't even waste time sending a posse after you." "Now, that's what I call real friendly. You wouldn't even put the sheriff out about me?" "Certainly not. Suppose he caught you? He'd probably get 2 or 3 men knocked in the head doing it, and 1,500 ain't worth all that bloodshed." "I see you got a kind heart," said the other carelessly. "Also, I've noticed that every real professional along your line has a pile of pals. Suppose I get you. The word is passed along. One of your friends comes and tries his hand with me just to get even. You see, I ain't bluffing." "I see you ain't bluffing," said the other. He flushed and straightened a little. "But if you come from my part of the country, you wouldn't say that I hunted with any gang. I play a lone hand, partner. I've never seen the crook yet that you could trust as a friend." There was in this speech such naive and direct comment upon the bandit himself that the rancher could not forbear a smile. The other replied with instant good nature: "Which you've already said I'm a professional." He dropped the money bag into the saddle pouch. "You really work alone?" "Why, you can call it that. But I got my gang. I got a hoss and a gun, which makes 3 of us, and they's both been well tried out and not found wantin'." "No, but that hoss of yours don't look particular like a prize, Mr. Dreer," replied the other quietly. "Jess Dreer." Valentine looked back into his memory. It presented a blank to him. "It's the right name," said the other, "but you won't remember it. I'm a quiet man, sir, and I got quiet ways." End of chapters 3 and 4. Chapters 5 and 6 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. At this, Valentine looked him in the eye. After a moment a faint smile came in the eyes of the rancher, and the same smile was reflected in the eye of the bandit. It was an expression of infinite understanding. "I am Morgan Valentine," said the older man at length. "Mr. Valentine, it's a pleasure to know you." The rancher extended his hand, but the other, appearing to be in the act of bowing very lightly, in a most courtly manner, was apparently unaware of the proffered hand, which Valentine presently dropped back upon his knee. This time his smile broadened, deepened, and struck the corners of his mouth full of wrinkles. "My hoss, as you say," went on the bandit, "ain't a blue ribbon winner in a beauty show, but she has her points. Step up, Angelina." At this the mustang lifted a weary head, flattened both ears against her neck, and came at once to her master. "Why, she comes to you like a dog," said the rancher in admiring surprise. "Sure, and she'd sink her teeth in me like a dog, if she got a chance. Get back, you she-devil." "The out sneakin'est hoss I ever see, Angelina is, Mr. Valentine." The mustang had, indeed, slipped around to the back of Jess Dreer, and her great yellow teeth were bared as her upper lip twitched up, and at the same time her eyes gleamed with a malevolence that made the rancher shiver. He even started up a little, but at the threat of Jess Dreer the roan shrank away. In the meantime her master stood back. Always keeping an eye upon his hold-up victim, he expatiated upon the fine points of his mount. "She's got a lumpish head," he admitted, "and her neck ain't particular full, but look at those quarters, and look at those well set down hocks, and the way her high withers turns. And see how deep girted she is, though she's a bit tucked up now, as you say. Give me a hoss with plenty of bone, and she's sure got it. Yes, sir, 8 years Angelina and me has been pals." "8 years with a man killer," said the rancher, his interest still growing. "You ought to do very well as a lion tamer, Mr. Dreer." "Lions," declared the outlaw, genially, "has nothing on Angelina. She's ripped up my forearm with her teeth." He pointed to part of a white scar, which ran down beneath the cuff of his shirt, almost to the palm of his hand. "And she's nicked me with her heels." He indicated a white scar which began at the top of his forehead, and furrowed its way into his hair. "If she can't kick, she'll strike, and if she can't strike, she'll bite. And if she's fooled one day, she'll be a lamb for a month, and then try to murder you in 10 ways in 10 seconds." He paused and smiled upon the mare with an open-hearted affection. "Why the devil do you keep her, then?" "Partly because, though there's plenty that can outsprint her, I ain't ever seen anything that can keep up with her after the first 10 miles. And my work is chiefly long-distance stuff." He confided the last remark to the rancher with a perfect calm. "Personally," said Valentine, shuddering, "I've never seen a hoss with so much devil in its face. I'd rather have 3 men with guns behind me than that hoss under me. The chances is about even for me to kill her or for her to kill me. Either way, it's been a good fight, and I've had a ringside seat." "You're a queer creature," the rancher smiled, clasping his hands upon one knee, and rocking back in his seat as though he wished to get a more distant and complete perspective of his new acquaintance. "If I had that mare, the first thing I'd do would be to fill her full of lead. I wouldn't sell her any more than I'd sell a man his own death warrant." "Sir, she's a genius. She got her brains from the devil. For 8 years we've been studying each other, and we've both still got a lot to learn." As he said this, his lower jaw jutted out a little, and the muscles stood out in hard knots below the ears. Morgan Valentine blinked. He had had a glimpse of a face of such demoniac cruelty, such murderous hatred, that he was shaken to the core. When he looked again, he saw that the bandit had smoothed his expression again. It was the former calm, sad face. "I begin to see," the rancher nodded. "Even a nightmare may be interesting. Has no one else ever ridden her?" A shade crossed the face of the outlaw. "If anyone else ever did," he said, "I'd give her away, or shoot her and leave her for the buzzards. A thing that's mine has got to belong to me got to be all mine. The reason I can ride Angelina and nobody else can is because I go at her in the right way. I get her scared she don't never know what's comin' next, what I've got up my sleeve, and so we get along tolerable well. But if she ever finds out that I've been bluffing her, there won't be enough of me left to put in a box." And so saying, he smiled again, genially, upon the roan, and her ears flattened against her neck. "Well, much obliged for the coin and the friendly chat," the outlaw remarked, in tones of finality. "Wait a minute." Morgan Valentine was rubbing his chin with his knuckles. "Well?" said the bandit, a trifle impatiently. "Which way might you be going?" The other looked sharply at Valentine, and then shrugged his shoulders. "Over yonder," he said. "That's the way I'm going, Drear. Suppose you rest your hoss for a spell, and come along with me." A gleam of suspicion flashed into the face of the bandit, and once again Valentine glimpsed that fathomless, cruel strength of will and insight. Then he thought of a way to tempt the big man. "They ain't much to be afraid of," he said. "My gun is in the back of the wagon." "Why," and Jess Drear grinned, "this sounds to me like a real party." And he sprang instantly into the wagon and sat down beside the rancher. Chapter VI. Morgan Valentine concealed his triumph, or sought to do so, by busying himself with taking up the reins and fastening them between his fingers. "But will your horse follow?" "It took me 2 years off and on to teach Angelina to follow, and I figure that if she lives to be 200 she won't forget what she's learned," the outlaw replied. Valentine spoke to the two geldings, and they struck their collars at the same instant in answer to his voice. But at once they settled down to their time-honored pace. In the meantime he was adjusting himself to his companion. It was plain to see that the other had accepted the invitation to ride with his victim simply in the light of a dare. Morgan had put himself side by side with a man who had already admitted to several killings, and he had allowed that man to choose his time and place for an attack. Yet the bandit, scorning to sit far to one side or to keep his head turned toward Valentine, sat perfectly erect in the seat, with his eyes fixed far down the road. It was not until Valentine, jerking his hand up swiftly to his cigarette, had made a definite move that could be construed as hostile, that his companion showed the slightest sign of being on the alert. Even then he did not turn his head, but Valentine was aware of a flash of those gray eyes to the side, and a tint of yellow in them. And all at once he knew that Jess Drear was fairly a-tremble with an electric watchfulness, that he was concentrating a tremendous energy in keeping aware of his companion, and that in the space of a split second he could have whirled in his seat and got at the throat of the rancher. It was not altogether a comfortable feeling for Valentine, but in his day he had had to do with many a hard man, and had even possessed a certain name for hardness himself. There were few men in that part of the mountain desert who would have cared to risk their lives on the speed and certainty of their gunplay as opposed to the speed and certainty of Morgan Valentine, for he was a cold-headed man, a cold-blooded man, and he fought with the same nerveless accuracy with which he lived, with which he had married, with which he had raised his children. The death of his brother, the coming departure of his brother's child, these were the emotional landmarks of his life. Indeed, it was a sense of loneliness, of lack of food to fill his mind and his heart, that had made him ask the bandit to ride with him. There was also a lingering hope that he might be able to turn the tables upon his antagonist, for there was never a man born, at least none worthy of the name of man, who did not have somewhere in the bottom of his heart love for an honest fight. Yet he had sense enough to guess that whatever his prowess might be with weapons, it would be as nothing compared to the man in the seat beside him, for Jess Drear was his antithesis. If he was without nerves, Jess Dreer was full of little else. And the calm exterior of Dreer was a disguise maintained by an almost muscular effort. Beneath the disguise there was a mind of wolfish alertness. It suddenly occurred to Valentine that this man might be many years younger than he seemed, for he was of the kind who age rapidly. And the interest of Valentine was by no means entirely malicious, as has been hinted. In Jess Dreer he crossed a new type of man, and he was curious to read beneath the surface. "You've had your horse for 8 years," said the rancher, and he looked down at the holster at the hip of his companion, "but I'll chance a guess that you've had the gun a good deal longer. This gun?" With a gesture so smooth that the eye failed to appreciate its speed, the bandit reached back and with the tips of his fingers, so it seemed, flicked the revolver out. It lay in the palm of his hand, under the eye of Morgan Valentine. Suppose he were to strike up, would he knock that weapon out of the open hand and send it spinning? Something told him that, swift as his blow might be, the long brown fingers would move with vastly more speed to curl around the gun. The very thought of what might happen perceptibly lowered the temperature of the rancher's blood. He saw that it was, as he had guessed, a very old weapon. It bore evidence of the most meticulous care, but in spite of that, an expert could see at a glance that it had passed its palmy days as an engine of destruction. "Now, there's a gun that ain't much to look at," said the bandit, and his singularly winning smile softened his face for a moment. "And between you and me, it ain't much better'n it looks. It bucks like a wild coat, it's got funny ways, it shoots the way a one-eyed hoss runs, it keeps veering off to one side. Well, it's a hard shooter, if you know its ways." He paused, then added, "I seen it thrown out of the door into the ash can one day, and I picked it up." "Just like this?" "All the parts was there, but it was considerable chewed up with rust. You can see where it's eat away in places. It was on a Friday that I seen that gun throwed away." "Unlucky day?" "Unlucky for most, but I run by opposites, and when I see it fall, I says, 'There goes somebody's bad luck. Maybe it'll be my good luck.' So I took out the gun, and spent the off time for the next couple of days oiling it up. Then I went out and tried her. Lordy! I shot a circle around a knot. She had 20 queer tricks, that gun had. But after a while I got to know the tricks, and now she does pretty smooth, neat work. You see?" The gun flipped up in the long fingers, and without raising his hand off his knees, the bandit fired. 20 yards away a squirrel, standing up like a peg beside its hole, was blown to bits. The geldings plunged at the explosion of the gun, and the bandit burst at once into a stream of excuses. "Now, ain't that a fool kid thing to do?" he cried, "shooting a gun without asking you if your hosses was gun broke? Well, sir, call me a blockhead, because I am one. Mr. Valentine, I sure am sorry." Indeed, his words did not seem overdone, for his earnest gray eyes were upon the rancher in a species of entreaty. "Dreer," said the cattleman, earnestly, as soon as he had quieted the horse, "you don't have to apologize. It was worth it, to see that gun act all by itself." But the other shook his head, and returned the weapon to its leather. "You see," he explained, "that gun is almost human to me. Suppose you had a friend with you when you got into a fight, and it was dead sure cinch that you'd get plugged if your friend didn't stand up and play the man by you. And suppose you never knowed whether that friend would fight like a devil, or else lie down and quit, like a greaser. Well, sir, that's the way it is with that gun. If I shoot with it, I have to look twice to see if I've hit a thing." "And yet you still carry it. You still let your safety depend on that old rattletrap?" The crimson departed suddenly from the face of the stranger, and the muscle at the angle of his jaw leaped out into prominence. "Sir," he said quietly, "there's one thing that I appreciate, and that's a gent that chooses his words. Rattletrap ain't particular accurate, speaking about my gun. Why, Dreer, you've as good as said as much as that yourself." The other turned his face, and there was the old unpleasant glint in his eyes. "I'm a peaceable man, Mr. Valentine," he said. "Matter of fact, I'm a quiet kind of a gent, and I mostly hate trouble, but I don't think you and me are going to agree." Morgan Valentine was too dumbfounded to reply. "In the first place, sir," went on the stranger, "you say you don't think nothing particular fine about my hoss. Then I let that pass, and I just throw in a few qualifying remarks about the roan, and pretty soon you up and say my gun is a rattletrap." He was unable to continue for a moment. "But after you just said practically the same thing yourself, man." "Sure, whatever else may be wrong with that gun, it's mine, and being mine, they ain't any man in the world that I'm going to hear say things about it that they won't stand up and prove. And speaking man to man, I can sure digest a pile of that sort of proof before I admit that I'm wrong." A veritable devil was in his face as he spoke, and the long brown fingers were becoming restless upon his knee. Then, very suddenly, and a most welcome sight to Valentine, the blood rushed into the face of the tall man again. "Hanged if I didn't forget for a minute," he said, "that I was your guest, riding in your wagon. Mr. Valentine, I got to ask your pardon again. Just stop the buckboard, and I'll get out and climb on the roan. There ain't any man living whose pardon I've asked 3 times hand running, and I've done it twice by you already." "Sit still," replied Morgan Valentine. "I figure to keep you here and take you home with me." End of chapters 5 and 6. Chapters 7 and 8 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. It should not be thought that Valentine was that cheap type of fellow who attempts to carry his points by surprise, but as the stranger talked with him, the gradual conviction grew in him that he must see more of Jess Dreer. In the meantime, Jess stared at his host as though the latter had gone mad. "Mr. Valentine," he said, "I ain't prying into what's behind your mind. I'll just say one little thing. I ain't been under the roof of another man for 8 years as a friend." "Well, then, if you object to coming as a friend, come as an enemy." "With the bars down, and you free to call in the sheriff when you please?" "Dreer, do you think I'm the sort who'd call in a sheriff while you're under my roof?" "I didn't mean no insult," replied the bandit more gently, "but I ain't a mind reader, Mr. Valentine. Why the devil should you want me to come home with you?" "Because," said the rancher, "although I've lived some 50 years and a bit more, I don't think I've met more'n 2 men that particularly interested me, and you're one of 'em. As a matter of fact, there's nothing so strange. You've taken some of my money. Well, what you've taken won't break me. I'm what you might call a pretty well-to-do man, Dreer. Now, I'd spend 1,500 on a fine hoss and never think twice about it. Why shouldn't I spend 1,500 for a man and enjoy talking to him? Think it over. I stick you up and lift 1,500 iron men, then you step out and ask me home. I go to your home. I put my legs under your table. I eat your chuck." He made a face of disgust. "I couldn't do it, partner, even though you don't mean nothing but kindness." "Well, think it over," echoed the rancher. A silence fell. The geldings jogged relentlessly, tirelessly forward. The roan cantered softly behind the buckboard. "If I could figure how you'd gain anything," the bandit murmured finally, "I might chance it, but—" "Take your time and think it over," insisted Morgan Valentine. "Well, sir," said the bandit suddenly, "I'll call your bluff. If it's a trap, well, a nerve like yours ought to catch something. I'll go home with you." Valentine stretched out his hand, but the tall man glanced down at the stubby, proffered fist, and then back to the rancher. "Some ways," he said, "you might put me down as queer, but I ain't any too fond of shaking hands. You see, a handshake means a pile to me. I shook hands with a man that sold me to a sheriff once." "And the sheriff got you?" "No, the other way around. But I couldn't touch the gent that had double-crossed me, the skunk, because I'd shaken hands with him. Now, remembering that, I guess you'll change your mind about this handshaking." "It goes with me as far as it goes with you." Suddenly they shook hands. Then they said in one voice, like a trained chorus, "That takes a load off my mind." In the meantime the evening was approaching. The early night had patched the mountains with purple, and filled every ravine with tides of incredible blue. Before them the hills began to divide. "Do you know something?" asked the bandit. Valentine saw that his companion was leaning far forward, his elbows on his knees and his face wistful. It meant a great deal more than words, that unguarded attitude. It meant that Morgan Valentine had been judged by this man, and had been accepted according to his standards. "What's that?" "Yonder, behind them hills. Well, I'll be stepping out into a new part of my life." "I wouldn't wonder much if you were." Still the geldings jogged on, and the hills moved by them slowly, awkwardly, growing each moment more dusky. They turned a sharp bend, and below them lay the valley of the Crane River. Above it the red of the sunset filled the sky, and the river itself was a streak of dark crimson. "Give me the reins," said the bandit. Silently the rancher passed them to his companion, who now gathered them in closer. He did not speak a word, but perhaps the tenseness of the reins, the new weight vibrating against their bits, carried a message to the geldings. Of one accord they stepped out into a freer gait, their heads raised, their ears pricked. Life came into their step. If two whips had touched them at the same instant, the effect could not have been more noticeable. And it seemed to Morgan Valentine that a current of strength and knowledge was passing down the reins and into the minds of the dumb brutes. To him it was more than a miracle. "Do you know," he said, as the buckboard was whipped forward with redoubled speed, and jolted noisily over the bumps in the road, "that's the first time I've seen those nags change that old dog trot of theirs." The bandit made no reply for some time. He was changing the pressure on the reins. First the off horse came up on the bit and strained against the collar; then the near horse, who had been pulled back, was released and quickened his pace, until he was snorting beside his companion, and even ahead of him; and then both increased their pace, and the jolting was redoubled. "Look at that!" murmured the bandit. "As long as they agreed, they wasn't worth a nickel; as long as they went ahead at that same old sleepy trot, they wasn't worth powder and lead enough to blow their heads off. But now they're beginning to try each other out. They're beginning to race. I tell you what, Valentine, the way to get the most out of men or hosses is to play 'em one agin the other." Indeed, the two geldings now had their heads as high as if they were just beginning a journey, higher than they had ever held them for Morgan Valentine; and the latter was naturally full of thought as the buckboard careened down the hillside and dropped into the valley floor. Now and again, as the dusk thickened, he looked behind him and saw the roan mare following patiently, always with her ears flat against her neck. It was almost as if the fear of the master she hated were still in the saddle, spurring her on, curbing her free spirit, and breaking it to do his will. Something in this thought made him look up at the face of the bandit, and he saw him sitting with his face tense, and a light of cruel enjoyment in his eyes. It was as if he drew a deep delight out of the rivalry which he had put in the hearts of the two geldings. It was, of course, night when they reached the stables behind the ranch house, although the moon, which hung over Grizzly Peak, was sending a faint slant light down the valley. One of the hands came out to unhitch the horses, but the outlaw insisted upon handling his own mount. He led it into one of the individual corrals. "A roof over her head always sort of bothers Angelina," he explained, while the rancher looked on in curiosity. He watered her carefully, fed her grain and hay in cautious portions, and rubbed away the sweat under the saddle blanket. Yet the instant he turned to answer a word from the rancher, she whirled on her master. He did not turn his head to make sure that she was coming. Though she veered noiselessly, her master did not pause, but leaped straight for the bars and vaulted over them. The teeth of the mare clicked with the noise of a steel trap shutting, just at the place where his hand had rested on the top bar. "Ah, beauty! Ah, Angelina!" cried Jess Dreer, and came back to the bars. "Eyes in the back of my head, girl, and to morrow you'll pay for this. Remember? To morrow or the next day. It's added to the score." There was at this point a sudden outbreak of snorting, and a rattle of harness from the big watering trough. "What the dickens! Judd! Harry!" a man was crying. "What the devil has got into you? Quiet there!" "By heaven!" murmured the rancher, "the geldings are fighting." "Is that strange?" asked Jess Dreer. "They've lived like two brothers, which they are, ever since they were foaled." "All the better," said Jess Dreer, gaily. "A hoss is like a man needs a good fight now and then to keep him on edge." And Morgan Valentine shivered. He did not say another word on the way to the house. He was beginning to think of many things. Chapter 8 It was not until they had reached the very shadow of the sprawling old house that the rancher recovered from his absent-mindedness. "How am I to introduce you?" he asked. "As Jess Dreer," said the bandit. "I guess I've outrode my reputation." "I think so. But where have I met you?" "Somewhere South." "I haven't traveled about much in the South. Let me see. 5 years ago I was in Ireton. Have you ever been there?" "No. What's it like?" "Common cow town." "All right. I know it, then. You met me there." "That's all I have to say, unless Mary starts asking questions. She's the outbeatenest girl for talking when she gets started on a thing." At this the bandit sidestepped and scowled at his companion. "You hitched up to a pile of women folks?" he muttered. "My wife and my daughter won't bother you none, and my 2 boys knows what's manners between men. But Mary she's my niece can make a murderer talk if she sets her mind right on it." At this the bandit chuckled. It was always a surprise to hear the soft, musical voice of this man. "Leave her to me, partner. It's been a good many years since I got my imagination all going at once, but when I get oiled up I can spin the yarns out all night. What was the name of that town? Ireton? Nothing queer about it? Well, leave the rest to me, Valentine. If she wants talk, I'll let her have it." "Ay, but one thing more, while we're on the subject of Mary. She's a fine girl, Dreer, but she has her ways, and one of them is to get all excited about any stranger man that comes around. She starts in by being foolish about 'em, and most generally they wind up being foolish about her. Now, I don't mean that you're the kind to get foolish about any girl, but I'm just telling you beforehand that if Mary begins to smile at you and act like you was a gold mine that she'd discovered all by herself, don't let it bother you. Don't bother none about me, Valentine. I'm well broke, partner. I ain't gun shy, and I ain't girl shy. Lead on." Since the night had turned crisp, Valentine found his entire family grouped near the big fireplace in the living room. They were in characteristic attitudes. Maud Valentine sat with her feet tucked well back under her chair, and her knitting needles flew with soft precision. Elizabeth, her daughter, lay in a big chair with her hands locked behind her head, looking dreamily out the black window. In another corner Mary was plotting with Charlie Valentine, and Louis, disconsolately out of the picture, attempted to bury himself in a book, out of which he lifted envious glances at Charlie from time to time. When the door opened, there was a general shifting of eyes and attitudes. The tall and deceptively graceful form of Jess Dreer became the centre of attention. "Mother, I've brought home an old friend, Jess Dreer. Dreer, this is my girl Elizabeth. Mary Valentine, my niece, and my boys, Charlie and Louis." They shook hands. How much did the bandit learn from the touch of their fingers, from the cold, faint pressure of Mrs. Valentine, from the grip of Charlie, boyishly eager to test the comparative strength of this tall stranger, from the nervous touch of Louis's hand, for Louis was always ill at ease and apt to be embarrassed before newcomers. 'Lisbeth greeted him at the full distance of her rather thin arm. She was one of those who come late to womanhood. Her eyes still held that infinite quiet of childhood. Her throat was small, but her mouth had a kindly softness. She would never have Mary Valentine's gem-like beauty of detail, but in time she would ripen to a rare womanhood. And as for Mary, her hand and her glance both lingered on him. It was as if she had seen him before, and was now trying to resurrect the complete memory. Mrs. Valentine took them into the dining room, and there she busied herself all the time they were eating by popping up out of her chair and running to get something as soon as she was once fairly seated. She discovered that Morgan's napkin was spotted, that his favorite chow-chow had been left off the table, that the baked potatoes were underdone, for which the cook received a brief, stern sentence, that the window was too widely open. In short, she spent the entire space of the meal asking Jess Dreer how long he had been in that part of the country, and interrupting herself every time before she got through with the interrogation. Finally, she forgot all about her question, and sat, as usual, with a smile of attention on her lips, listening to the men talk, while her eyes roved wistfully about the table, hunting for the missing things. Yet never once did she win a glance from Morgan Valentine. She filled the time of the meal with an atmosphere of flurry and uncertainty, quite unheeded by her husband. But once, twice, the gray eye of Jess Dreer fixed her through and through, and tumbled her sad small soul into full view. Not that she understood it, she only felt a vague fear of the stranger, his silences, his alert calm. When they went back into the living room, 2 big chairs were drawn comfortably near the fire, and the other chairs arranged in a loose semicircle on both sides of the fireplace, so that the travelers could rest in ease. "And how's young Norman?" asked Morgan Valentine. He had turned to Charley, but the latter indicated Louis with a jerk of his thumb. "I dunno. Lou went over to see how Joe was comin' on." "I rode over," said Louis, embarrassed by the sudden focusing of all eyes upon him, "but I might as well have stayed away. They was about 1,000 Normans hanging around the house. When I come up the path from the hitchin' rack, there was about a dozen of 'em on the front veranda. I hear 'em say, 'It's him.' 'No,' says someone, 'it ain't him, but his brother.' Then I come up and says howdy to 'em, but all they do is grunt like pigs." "Which they are," cried Charley. The chair of Morgan Valentine creaked as he turned, and under his glance his eldest son lowered his gaze. All of this by-play was noted by the shrewd eye of the bandit; and the fact that he had been observed by a stranger to endure a reprimand made Charley jerk up his head again, and glare defiantly at Jess Dreer. The latter did not turn his head politely as another man might have done. He met the challenging glance of the younger man with a calm indifference, so that it could be felt he was coolly measuring the other, and filing an estimate of him away. "Anyway," went on Louis, "I went up to the door and knocked. Mrs. Norman came, and I took off my hat and says, 'I've come to ask after Joe. How is he?' She didn't say nothing for a minute. She just stood there, drying the dishwater off her hands, and looking me up and down. 'Oh,' she says after a while, 'it's you, is it? And why didn't your brother come and ask about his murdered man?' And when she said that, all the men on the veranda growled. I turned away, and didn't say any more." "Oh!" cried Mary Valentine, "I wish that I had been in your boots. I'd have found something to say." "Mary," said Mrs. Valentine, "it looks to me like you found too much to say other times." Her husband checked her with a swiftly raised hand, but Mary continued to stare defiantly at her aunt. Since the episode of Joe Norman they had been almost openly at war, and now Mrs. Valentine compressed her lips and knitted with a venomous speed. "You needn't think that I wouldn't have talked back fast enough if one of the men had talked up," said Louis, turning red. "I wasn't afraid of any of 'em, Mary, if that's what you mean." "You know it isn't what I mean, Lou," she said, with a diplomatic change of voice. "Nobody is fool enough to doubt your courage. You're a Valentine, I guess. But it makes me mad to think of you turning away without giving that mob a few hot shots between wind and water." "I wish I'd had the chance at 'em," said Charley ferociously, and he flashed Mary a glance that sought approval. "Good thing you hadn't," replied the girl instantly. "You'd probably have had 10 men on your hands in no time. Better to say nothing at all, like Lou, than say the wrong thing." It made Charley glower at her, but Louis smiled in triumph. Plainly Jess Dreer saw how the clever girl balanced one of them against the other. "But here we are talking family shop before a stranger," continued Mary Valentine, and she smiled an apology at Jess Dreer. He shifted his regard from Louis to his cousin, and if ever a smile failed to strike its target, certainly Mary's smile glanced harmlessly away from the impersonal eyes of Dreer. She found herself suddenly sobered. "Don't mind me," he was saying in that surprisingly gentle voice. "A little fracas," explained his host swiftly. "Charley had a mix-up with Joe Norman, and dropped him through the arm. Nothing to talk of." Here Mrs. Valentine raised her eyes, let her glance fall pointedly upon Mary, sighed, and shook her head. It was impossible to miss her meaning. Mary had been the cause of the quarrel, but Jess Dreer was looking toward the ceiling, and had apparently seen nothing. Mary did not know whether to be relieved or piqued. But now that the stranger's attention was diverted to other things, she took the occasion to examine him more minutely. Ordinarily, she was not in the least interested in the few acquaintances whom her uncle brought home, but now she discovered that this stranger was probably not quite so old as his weather-beaten appearance had at first led her to imagine. Then she found that the conversation had taken a new turn. Mrs. Valentine apparently felt that it was the part of a perfect hostess to draw the stranger into the centre of attention. "How long have you and Mr. Dreer known each other, Morgan?" she asked. End of chapters 7 and 8. Chapters 9 and 10 of The Long, Long Trail by Max Brand. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. At this, Morgan Valentine flashed a glance at his companion, indicating that the danger line was being approached. "Oh, about 5 years," he said carelessly. He should have said more. His very carelessness made Mrs. Valentine continue her inquiry, as though she feared that Dreer might consider himself slighted by so summary a dismissal from conversation. 5 years? Well, you're a secretive man, Morgan. Would you believe, Mr. Dreer, that he's never mentioned you in all that time? I've known him to do the same with some of his oldest and best friends. That's Morgan's way. Where was it you first met Mr. Dreer, Morgan?" "Down in Ireton." "Well, well, as long ago as that?" And the subject was closed for Mrs. Valentine. Then Mary entered the lists. "Why, that was the time you bought the timber, Uncle Morgan." "I guess it was. I disremember." "Were you one of the men Uncle Morgan bought it from?" "I never been interested in timber," said Jess Dreer. "Horses is more my line, but speaking about timber—" Who knows how far he might have rambled afield on the subject of timber and all its possibilities, had not chance interrupted him. There was a snap, and a bright coal leaped out of the fireplace and onto the rug. In the flurry of putting it out, Dreer's promised anecdote was forgotten, and before he could resume it, Mary was back on the subject. "Oh, did you buy that string of grays for Mr. Dreer, Uncle Morgan?" "I disremember how it was that I met Dreer," said Valentine, with a mild voice like that of one who labors in vain to find a suitable lie. Dreer came to his rescue. "Was in Tolliver's saloon. We were drinking. Why, Uncle Morgan, I thought it was 10 years since you've had a drink." "Not drinking whiskey," put in Jess Dreer calmly. "Leastways, he was taking lemonade, and I was tossing off my red eye. That was how we come to talk." As plain as day the steady eye of the girl said to him, "You are lying, Mr. Jess Dreer, and I know it." But he went on. "And I'll tell you why Mr. Valentine ain't ever mentioned me. It's because he's a modest man. But here's the facts. I was saying that I had been drinking whiskey. Well, when I went out into the sun, it got into my head and made it spin. When I climbed onto my hoss, I raked his side with a spur, and the next thing I knew my pinto was 10 feet in the air. When he landed, I kept right on traveling. And when Pinto seen me on the ground, he allowed as I was his meat and started for me. He was a man-eater, was Pinto. There I lay, stretched out, with 850 pounds of red-eyed hoss-flesh tearing for me, and about 20 fools laughing their heads off in front of the saloon. But there was one man cool enough to see what was coming off a man-killing. He had a split part of a second to keep that hoss from reaching me, and he done it. He outs with his gun, and drills Pinto clean through the temples. As pretty a snapshot as ever I seen. And that man was Morgan Valentine." He dropped his hand lightly on the shoulder of Valentine. "But he's so modest that it ain't no wonder he's never talked about me." Now Mary Valentine sat next to the tall stranger, and she was leaning forward to catch every syllable and read every detail of his expression. But for some reason he did not seem to see her. His target lay beyond. It was Elizabeth, who had pushed her chair a little out of line with the rest of the circle, quite content to let Mary take the lion's share of the attention of the evening. On her Jess Dreer bent his steady eye, and every inflection of his voice was aimed at the girl, so that she, too, leaned forward, and before the end was smiling in breathless interest. While the general exclamation went the rounds at the end of the tale, Mary snapped a glance over her shoulder at her cousin. Then she turned her attention back upon the tall man. "I guess you've made that a bit strong," Valentine was saying. "Facts are facts," said the bandit, and rolled a cigarette. He had adroitly pushed his host out of the embarrassing centre of the stage, and stepped into the spotlight himself. "Pinto reared when the lead hit him. Comin' down, one of his forefeet clipped me here," and the bandit touched the scar upon his forehead. There was a general leaning forward, and an intaken breath. Mrs. Valentine fixed her starry eyes upon her husband. In the clamor, Mary could say to the stranger without fear of being overheard: "Mr. Dreer, how much of that is made up?" He neither smiled nor flushed. "Guess," he said. "The whole thing." "Lady," he answered calmly, "you sure got faith in my imagination." At this point the fire blazed up so hot that Mrs. Valentine had to move her chair. It was Jess Dreer who read her wish, and pulled the chair back, and when he sat down again it was in a place beside 'Lisbeth. It would not be fair to Mary to say that she was piqued by this occurrence. She was not angered; she was merely gathered up in the silence of a vast astonishment. For the first time in her life she had been overlooked, it seemed, and her cousin was preferred. And yet she had given Jess Dreer his full share of intriguing glances and bright smiles. Indeed, the interest of the stranger in 'Lisbeth was so pointed that the whole family began to notice. He gave his host and hostess a phrase or a word now and then, but he contrived to make his talk go constantly toward the girl; and it was plain that Mrs. Valentine was not altogether displeased. As for Elizabeth, Mary saw her at first embarrassed, and then flushed, and then lost in a great interest. She was beginning to dwell on the face of Dreer while he spoke. Mary drew her uncle to one side. "Your friend likes 'Lizabeth," she said pointedly, "and 'Lizabeth seems to like him. Now, Mary, what are you aimin' to come at?" "I aim to know who Jess Dreer is. Ain't you been told tolerable in detail?" "Too much detail, dear Uncle Morgan. Do you think I was taken in by that cock and bull story about the mad horse?" "Hush, Mary!" and his glance sought his wife guiltily. "I knew it." "Mary, you're a nuisance." "But just tell me who he is, and I won't bother you a word more." "He's a man. 2 legs, tolerable long, 2 arms, tolerable strong, and, speakin' in general, he's like any other man." "He's as much like any other man," said the girl, watching him earnestly, "as a wolf is like a dog. Look at his hands, Uncle Morgan. They're brown. He hasn't worn gloves much, the way honest cowpunchers do. Look at the inside of his palms no calluses. I noticed when I shook hands with him. Look at the way he moves like a cat moves, Uncle. Don't tell me he's an ordinary man." "They's all kinds of men, and when you're older you'll know it. Wolf? That's foolishness, honey." "A wolf, Uncle? You think he's talking too much to 'Lizabeth?" "Oh, no, 'Lizabeth is too much of a baby to be harmed." "She's grown up, Mary." "On the outside. Inside she's about 10 years old. But I'm right about this stranger. Even Charley and Louis see that he's different. Usually Charley starts edging up to new men, but he keeps clear of Dreer. See how he eyes him?" "There you go again." "Then tell the truth about him." "I'll tell you this much, honey. He's not the kind for you to set your cap for." "You mean that you think I'll flirt with him?" "Maybe." "Uncle, with a man 15 years older than I am?" "Maybe not so old as that, but he's old enough. You've played around with boys, Mary, and they was no particular harm in it, excepting for getting Charley into scrapes now and then. But when you start making eyes at a grown man, trouble will hit you, and not them. You admit that it isn't very safe to be friendly with him, and yet you've known him 5 years." "No matter how long. I know him, and you keep away from him, honey." "How long does he stay?" "Till after you go." "Somewhere there's a mystery," said Mary Valentine, and she added suddenly: "There he is, laughing at us now. Why, he knows we're talking about him, and he's mocking me." "Honey, he ain't laughing. With his eyes, Uncle Morgan. Oh, he's a deep one." Chapter 10 If Valentine had sought to create a diversion and start new interests by bringing his bandit home, he had indubitably succeeded. The advent of the stranger had the effect of a bomb which is about to explode. No one could really have said why Drear was exciting, but before he had been in the room for 10 minutes, each member of Valentine's family had felt the same influence of excitement which had affected Morgan Valentine, and induced him to bring the stranger to his home. Perhaps it was that in spite of the grave decorum of Drear's manner, one felt about him a native wildness. In a way, it might be said that he carried a gust of fresh air into the room, and he was constantly alert and active after the manner of wild things. His hands were rarely still, and though he seldom turned his head, his eyes went everywhere. When he smiled at a remark of Elizabeth's, Mary felt that he was laughing at her, and Charley felt that he was being mocked. Not that the stranger pointedly ignored the rest of the room, but it seemed that he had happened to sit down by Elizabeth, and he found her sufficiently entertaining. But the great point of wonder was that Elizabeth was actually talking. At first haltingly, confused because the eyes of the others in the room were occasionally turning upon her with wonder, but by degrees warming into complete forgetfulness of the rest. She lowered her voice. She was talking to the tall man alone. About what? The others caught fragments of phrases about her horses, about her last hunting trip, about the lobo she shot last spring. She had begun by asking timidly polite questions. She ended by chattering gaily about herself. It was a pretty thing to see her grow excited. What Mary Valentine could not decide was whether her cousin was excited by Jess Drear the man, or Jess Drear the audience. She was similarly puzzled by Drear. In another, she would have thought his attitude one of polite indifference, but she could not be sure of him and his mental status. She had known many a boy and many a boy's mind. They always showed their entire hand at once. One read the cards, was fascinated for a moment perhaps, and the next moment became bored because the antagonist was a known quantity. But Jess Drear was not known. He lurked behind a screen. He revealed not half, not a tithe of his strength, or of his weakness, for that matter. As far as Mary could make out, this fellow had brought 'Lisbeth out of her shell as another woman might have done. It was odd. Mary would have given a great deal to know why he winced when a door was opened behind him, why his eyes were apt to flash suddenly up, glitter and droop. She felt that he would be more content if his chair were back against the wall. It was at this point in her train of thought that the door-bell rang, and Mary sprang up to answer it. She was glad to get away from the room. She wanted to have the chill air of the night against her face, to breathe of it in the hope that it would clear a mist from her mind, and enable her to think logically and brush away her rising excitement. For the question was beating into her consciousness always, what is Jess Drear? Her uncle had put her off. Why? Or did he know? And was Jess Drear there because he had some claim and power over Morgan Valentine? She threw open the front door after she had gone thoughtfully down the hall, and she saw, dim figures in the moonlight, and with the reek of a long horseback ride about them, Sheriff Claney of Salt Springs and another man. Now, Sheriff Claney's boy had been one of Mary's victims in the near past, and that was the reason that she threw a conciliatory warmth into her greeting. "Why, Sheriff Claney, come in. Dad will be happy to see you." The sheriff smiled at her, and in smiling the ends of his drooping mustaches bristled out to the sides like tusks. "Mostly folks feel another way when I come along to say how do you do, but wait a minute, Mary, I ain't here on a pleasure call. You have business here?" She thought of Charley's affair with Joe Norman. "That miserable Norman family! Have they sent you after Charley?" The sheriff smiled disagreeably. "I dunno anything about Charley and the Norman boy," he said. "I don't go pryin' after trouble. Mostly enough of it comes my way without huntin'. All I want to do is to ask you a few questions, Mary." "And you won't come in?" "Nope. Is there a man in your house called Jess Drear?" The floodgates opened, the water burst through the dam, and Mary Valentine was picked up in a torrent of sudden knowledge. Jess Drear! The question flashed a lantern light on the man. "Jess Drear?" she repeated. "That's the name. Is he inside?" She fought for time. As a matter of fact, she was balancing between two impulses. The first was to hand this fellow over to the law at once. The second impulse was she did not know what, but certainly it was to keep him safe. What does he look like? About as tall as my friend here. Mr. John Caswell, Miss Mary Valentine. About as tall as Caswell, maybe a mite smaller, big shoulders, I understand, and the sort of a face that's easy to remember. Quiet, soft-spoken, active with his hands." She still paused. How fast her mind was working, and therefore her speech was slow. "Oh, yes, I remember now. Yes, there was a man like that here, and now that I remember, I think he said that his name was Jess Dreer. But he ain't here now?" "No, he rode away quite a while ago." "I told you so," said the big man who had been called Caswell. "That gent is a fox. He's got these people on his side." But Sheriff Claney hushed the other with a raised hand. "I think maybe you're mistaken, miss. We've got an idea that Dreer is in the house right now. Maybe he's hiding and you don't know it, but we got his hoss and his saddle. In fact, we found his hoss in the corral and saddled her, and now we got that hoss waiting for Mr. Dreer." "Of course you have his horse," Mary Valentine nodded. "He left the mare and took one of Dad's horses. I think he paid Dad something into the bargain for the exchange." "How long ago?" Sheriff Claney asked. "An hour. But, Sheriff, come on inside and search the house if you want." "Not if he's gone. Which way?" "He took that road. You ought to catch him in the mountains. How's your hoss, Caswell?" "Played out." "So's mine, pretty nigh." "Well, then, come in, Sheriff." For she knew perfectly that this bulldog would not leave the trail. She leaned against the side of the door and laughed at him. "I think that for a moment you suspected that we were sheltering him. But what's he done?" "What's he done?" Caswell said explosively. "What ain't he done? He's done enough to bring me 1,000 miles on the trail. What's he done? Why, that's Jess Dreer. They scare their kids with that name down south." One might have thought that Mary Valentine would shrink in horror at this news. She did not. No, a fire came into her eyes. "Is he as bad as all that? Oh, I hope you get him, Mr. Caswell." "Right down that road." She ran to the front of the veranda. "Hurry! I'll go back and tell Dad about it. He'll be after you in 5 minutes with fresh horses. He'll take along a couple of fresh mounts for you. Come on, Caswell." But Caswell, with his foot on the verge of taking the first step down, paused. "What I don't figure," he said, "is why Dreer left his own saddle behind. It's hard enough to figure why he left the hoss." "Because he knew you were on his heels, Caswell," cried Claney. "Hurry up, man. He's gaining miles on us." "How'd he know I was on his heels? Nobody else has given him a run, not for 5 years. He's always give the others too hot a reception at the end of the trail them that ever come up with him. Facts is facts. Come on." "I'm thinking." And he rubbed his chin and stared hard at Mary Valentine. "Don't you see that he's getting away?" she cried, in an apparent frenzy. "Seems to me, ma'am, that you're in a considerable trouble to have him caught. Most of the womenfolk I know most generally hopes he gets away. Caswell, I'm going on without you." "Wait a minute, Claney. It won't do." The latter turned and hurried back up the steps. "I'll tell you why," explained the man from the south. "That hoss has been with Dreer for 8 years. 10 times he could have changed her for a fresh hoss when he was being trailed, but he never wouldn't do it. And why does he do it now? Even if he knowed I was after him, that mare could have kept on going and run down a fresh hoss. She ain't common hoss flesh. She's all leather inside and out. I know her." "Well, where are you aiming?" Claney turned on Mary. "I'm aiming to search this house, and I don't think I'll have far to go." She stared at him an instant. "You're a little insulting," said Mary, drawing herself up; and then, seeing that he would persist in his purpose, she slipped before him and opened the door. "Come in, then," said Mary; but when he made a step forward, she slammed the door in his face, and the astonished sheriffs heard the heavy bolt click home. Chapters 9 and 10